Hi, welcome to video 2 of the Walnut and Maple Desk build series. In the first video, I cut all the dovetail joinery and dry fit this lower case that you're seeing here. There is a link to the first video in the description of this one if you care to go back and take a look. This is just a dry fit. Before I can actually assemble this, I've still got a lot more to do on it, starting with the curves that are on the front of this case. This is only going to be half a curve. This is going to mirror a longer curve that goes across the desktop. So what I'm doing here is I've got my center mark on this drawing bow, and I'm just lining that line up directly with the right side of this case, and I'm just going to trace the back side of it. It works out perfectly having it dry assembled because I've got those two stop points for the drawing bow, so I could just rest it right in there. Make sure it's where I want it. And I'm just marking the bottom. Once I get the bottom marked, I'll flip it over and mark the top, and then I'll rough cut them both out at the bandsaw. With the front of the case now shaped, I can move on to building and installing the back panel. I started that by routing a dado in the top, bottom, and two sides of the case. Once the dado is cut in, I can move on to the panel itself. The back panel is a book match made from a single wide piece of walnut that I had that was wide enough that when opened up, it was large enough to be this back panel. After ripping it in half at the bandsaw, I took each piece and milled them down to just slightly over 1/4 inch at the planer. After gluing up the panel, it can be taken down to its final thickness at the drum sander, which is just enough to give a slightly tight fit but also allow it to drop in easily into the case. Now that the structure of the base cabinet is complete, I'm actually going to move on from that, and I'm not going to worry about gluing it up just yet. There's still more work that needs to be done to it. What I'm going to be concentrating on instead is the legs and the base assembly that goes under it. Now I've got in front of me the piece of walnut that I'm going to be using for this. I'm going to try and make the entire assembly out of one piece of wood. There are a couple things that I need to watch out for in here. First of all, down here at the ends, I've got a little bit of checking going on, so I'm going to need to make sure that I'm avoiding that. Okay. Also, down the center of this, I've got a crack. It doesn't go all the way through. I can fill it with epoxy, but I really don't want to use it if I can avoid it. So I'm going to watch out for that. And then the rest of it looks pretty clean on this side, down to about here where there's a little bit more checking. So I'm going to try and fit it all in between those two marks. Now on the other side, when I flip this over, you can see that along this edge, I've got a pretty good crack going on, so I kind of need to avoid this side, if possible, down a couple inches there. These are the pieces that I'm laminating together to make the legs, and you can see why this is going to work for me, and I don't have to have 8/4 lumber for this. You can see the grain in this batch of wood that I got. The grain is just super straight, and you can see when I cut these and book match and flip them over, it's going to be really hard to see that they were laminated. The glue squeeze out from the lamination is scraped off with an old chisel before I take it back over to the joiner and joint 2 sides and then rip it to just a little over its final width. I'll bring the leg blank down to its final dimensions at the planer, where I can run it through on 2 sides to make sure that each dimension is exactly the same and that the legs are going to be perfectly square. I use the crosscut sled at the table saw to cut the legs to their final length. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark out the pieces, which one is which, and then I need to lay out my joinery. The final height on my rails is 1.5 inches, so that's the dimension I have to work within. I'm going to start my mortise 1/4 inch down. I think I'll make it a 1-inch mortise. And then I'll go for 1 1/4. So I'm going to lay out the first one with a little bit more detail than I need to do for all of them. Also, I want these to sit in. I'm probably going to give it a 1/4 inch offset back, and then, you know, being 3/4 of an inch thick, that means I need to set these back 1/2 inch. And there we go. So I can use this piece to set up the hollow chisel mortiser to get my distance from the fence where I'll cut my mortises. And then on the rest of them, I will just need to have the start and stop lines, this 1/4 inch, 1.25 inches down from the top, marked on them. The hollow chisel mortiser works really well to make quick work of making these mortises. However, it doesn't leave the cleanest surface at the bottom of the mortise. It needs cleanup. So what I'm going to do real quick is just go through and make sure I'm cleaning up the sides all the way down to my intended depth of the mortise. And then I'm going to clean out some of the debris that's left at the bottom. Which can be a little challenging to get out of there, depending on the size of the mortise. And I've got my square set to the depth of my tenon, to the length of the tenon. And so basically what I want to do to see if I'm done is make sure that there's no spots that it hits or that it pushes it up on the bottom. Make sure that it can go full depth into that mortise. After the stretchers have been cut to length, I use a marking gauge to scribe in the shoulders of the tenons. Back at the table saw, I have a dado stack installed, and I'm making just a couple of test cuts on the end of one of the stretchers. After each test cut, I'll check the fit with the mortise, raise the blade just a little bit, and try again until I've got just a slightly oversized tenon that I can clean up by hand. When I'm satisfied with the fit, I'll cut each tenon to its full length. When I cut these, I didn't cut them to their final fit. I left them just a little bit thick. And the reason I did that is so that I can get the perfect fit for each tenon for its mortise. And the goal will be to get a fit that I can easily insert, but still has a friction fit. As you can see in this one that I haven't fit yet, it's too tight. So what I'm going to do is take my block plane. This is a rabbiting block plane. Start with just a small pass or two. Test it. And making sure that however many passes I take on one side, I take the same on the other side. Almost. Still just a little tight. There you have one set. I created a pattern for the leg profiles that I mark onto the outside faces of all of my legs. With all the marks in place, I take them over to the bandsaw and cut them one side at a time, making sure to save all of the cutoffs as I have to tape them back on to cut the adjacent side. This can be a slow-going process between carefully cutting just on the waist side of the line, taping the piece back on, and making the next cut. I use the oscillating spindle sander to clean the legs up and remove all the bandsaw marks. I find this to be a great tool to clean up, especially curved surfaces, whether that's an inside curve or an outside curve. Just take your time, work it back to the line slowly, and it'll come out great every time. I put these curves on all of the legs, knowing that this was going to happen, but you can see here that the corner actually sticks out past the leg, leaving it, if I leave it squared off like this. You can also see on this one on the side here, I've already done what I'm going to do to the rest of them. I cut a 15-degree bevel down the top of that you can see leaves a reveal around it. Shapes that a little bit. I'll probably also round that out when I clean it up, when I sand it. So I'm going to do that all the way around, and then I'm also going to apply some roundovers to a lot of these surfaces, to all of these corners and the legs, to the bottom side of these rails. Some of that I may end up having to do by hand, like on these inside corners, or this inside here, but I'll do as much of that as I can with a router. But before I do that, this has to be cut in with a table saw. I wasn't able to use the router on a couple of the curves, so I had to round them over by hand. I'm using a combination of a rasp and some sandpaper that's glued onto the back of a thin piece of wood. This gives me the fine control that I need to clean up the rasp marks before moving on to hand sanding. I used a random orbit sander to sand everything down and to take the sharp edge off of that bevel that I cut earlier. The glue up was done in 2 stages, first gluing each of the 2 sides together and then gluing it together as one assembly. I used figure 8 clips to attach the base to the bottom cabinet, and in order to do that I have to drill out a series of recesses for the clips to sit in. I'm making sure to install the screws on the base by hand just to make sure I don't split any of those stretchers out. The base to the cabinet itself, as long as I pre-drill I don't have to worry about anything splitting, so I go ahead and use a driver to get everything attached. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you were able to get something out of it. In the next video, I'm going to be moving on to the upper desk assembly. The upper case will still have lots of dovetails that I'm going to have to cut in by hand, and then I've got a lot of internal components that I also have to install. Hopefully I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.